In this video, I wanted to explore Sass, everything about it from why it was created, what the benefits are, and essentially how to get started using it. If you haven't heard of it before, it's essentially doing CSS but with more features and functionality. I'm going to take you through each one of those features and how to start applying them so that you can save yourself time and code and make your life a lot easier when it comes to styling on the web. My name is Adrian, and if you haven't already, hit like and subscribe, and let's just jump right into it. So what is Sass? Well, it's essentially called syntactically awesome style sheets, but it's a lot more than that. Originally, when you used to use CSS, then you would be doing styles manually for every element, whether it's the colors you're applying, or even when you have an element very deep down, you have to redefine how far down that class is every single time you write the markup. What Sass did was it came along and gave you new functionality. It gave you the ability to nest classes within themselves. This would mean that you don't have to rewrite where they are every single time. It allowed you to start using variables, so it meant that you could define those at the start of a file and reuse them anywhere in your application. It would let you also do processing for all browsers. This pre-processing would mean that you can bundle your CSS straight in to be compatible with any browser, which saves a lot of time because sometimes you don't want to redo all your styling and class properties to work for every browser that's out there. We're going to take a look at each one of these in practice because they're very useful and they'll save you time and money. Now, in order to get started with Sass, you'll need to install the library, or you'll need to have an application which is compatible to start compiling Sass. I'm going to be using an application called Brackets with a plugin for Sass. It's going to compile my files on the fly, and I find it very useful. You can also have different plugins on VS Code that do the same thing, or you can install Sass manually through npm and just convert any files you need to on the fly as well. Alternatively, there are things like Webpack and Gulp, which will also do the same thing for you, but there's a little bit more setup involved. In this case, we're going to take a look at Brackets because it'll get us up and running much faster. We'll start by making sure Brackets is installed. We'll just jump on Google and we'll click on the very first result. We'll download and install it. Once it's up and running, we'll create a index.html file, and we'll create some very plain HTML5 docs in there with maybe importing Bootstrap. We'll jump into File and Extensions Manager, and we'll want to install the Sass extension. We'll do this by installing bracket Sass. Once this is installed, it'll automatically compile all our Sass code. We can create our very first Sass file. In here, let's create styles.scss. When we create that, it automatically generates two additional files, which is the css.map file and just the CSS file. We can have a look at how this works now in practice. If you're using styles.css and you want to do some markup, you would put in maybe section has a height of 100 pixels. Then you might have a section article which has maybe a width of 200 pixels. And then you might have a section.article h2 tag which has a height of 15 pixels. This is standard syntax, but as you can see, you have to repeat yourself quite often. In styles.css, we can use Sass to make this markup a lot easier. In here, we can do nesting. Nesting essentially means that we can start putting our classes inside of other classes. So in this case, we could have a section with a height of 100 pixels, an article with a width of 200 pixels, and a h2 tag of 15 pixels height. If we save this and apply the changes, once it's been compiled, all the code is automatically filling out the same sort of a syntax we had previously. But it makes the usability of the syntax much easier in Sass because you don't have to rewrite section each time you want to apply an article or a h2 tag. Another thing we can do is actually pass variables in and out of classes. We could create something like general height. And in here we might pass 55 pixels. Then we can actually apply this height down here below. If we save this code, we can see that it's automatically applied here on the right. We can also do really cool things like add 5 pixels to it, and it automatically does the calculation, which is really useful. We can then do other things such as even set a color, say primary color, and we might make this red. And here we can actually pull this primary color down to the H2 tag and use it. When we apply it, we can see that on the right hand side it has been applied properly after it's been compiled. We can also do other things with those variables, such as making it darker. We can pass the variable in and maybe make it 10% darker in this case. If we apply this, we can see that the hex code has been applied for a darker red rather than the normal. There's other commands you can use like lighten or even tint, but it just gives you an idea of some of the flexibility that you can apply. Another very useful thing with Sass is being able to do modules. This essentially means breaking your file down into smaller components. It then is able to be imported back into the primary file, and you can also use some of the variables and settings you define in that. For example, you might add an underscore partial.scss. The underscore makes sure that it isn't compiled. Then later you do an @ sign with a use and you reference your file. You can then pull in the base colors, or you can even make sure that some of the styling you've defined in that file takes effect in the post-compiled version of your CSS. Be aware that modules isn't always compatible with all versions of Sass, such as libsass and Ruby Sass. So in this case, we won't be able to use it. But if you're using Dart Sass, it should be compatible, and it's a very useful thing to have. Mixins are another really cool thing that Sass provides. They're essentially like functions, but for CSS. We define one by calling @mixin and putting a name in, such as square. Then we can pass a value, such as value, and define it below, such as a height equals the value and the width equals a value. This is essentially creating a square. Then we can call it in our classes. We'll call include, and we'll call the name of the mixin and pass a value, such as 100 pixels. When we do this, we're essentially creating a square that's 100 pixels. On the right hand side, we can see that our width and height have applied, which is really cool. We can also nest mixins, such as defining a rectangle. Then we can actually have some more parameters happen here. So what we can do is essentially nest mixins. We can pass a value down, such as include square, and pass the value there. Then we can do something like width is also the value times 2. If we copy this down now and apply it, we can see that the width and the height are being applied, but the second property that doubles the width is also being applied, which is really cool. Extending or inheriting properties is another thing that Sass lets you do. It's similar to mixins, but the syntax is a little bit different and you can't pass values in. You define it by calling a percentage sign and passing in a label, such as circle. Here we can put in border radius, and maybe we'll do that as 50%. We can then include that by running extend and passing in a percentage circle down below. When we do this and save the settings, we can see that it's being defined here up above. It's useful if you have, for example, a button design or something like that that you want to use across the board of your application. So before we finish up, I'll show you a few more other cool things. For example, here in the section, we might want to define a hover, and normally we would have to define it outside of the class, but in this case, we can nest it by using and typing in hover. And here we could make the background say red. That's pretty useful. In here, we might have an input, and we could also use the and sign to check in brackets if the type of input is a submit. And then we can apply different styling for that. That way we can have maybe the font size as being 18 pixels. We can extend on this ability of using the and sign to classes as well. We can check if an input has a class of success, and if it does, we can make the color green. Or for example, if it has a class of danger, then we can make the color red. That way we don't have to redefine everything every single time we're creating a class. And inside the tags, we just nest everything over and over, and it makes for a much cleaner syntax. Finally, we can also do things like imports. We could import, say, test.scss. And here we can create a new file called test.scss. we can define a new attribute such as secondary being blue. If we save that and go back into our main file and then say use that attribute, it will just automatically here work and pull that styling in. We can then separate out our files, so we can have some of the styling for the home page in one file while we have some of the styling for a contact us page on another. I hope this video has given you a good understanding of Sass and just some of the benefits that come along from being able to do things like nesting, variables, and mixins. For me, I know personally it's saved me hundreds of thousands of lines of code, and over the years that's saved me a lot of time. So if you like this kind of content, if you want to see more like it, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.